Good evening, Liberty.me peeps. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is our second week in dealing with the extraordinary book, Road to Serfdom. Let me just make sure my settings are correct. I was right to check. Okay, I think I've got a better microphone now. Sorry about that. This is our second week of dealing with Road to Serfdom, which is a 1944 book. I think one of the most underappreciated. And how do I measure that? Well, I would say this is probably the most famous and least read book ever. I was actually amused today when I was posting this all over Facebook that I was going to be doing this tonight. And I appreciate it very much, but people were sending the link around going, oh yeah, you should definitely read this book. You should read this book. This is a wonderful book. But people always, it's almost as if they're familiar with the existence of the book and they assume therefore that causes them to have read it in a way. Or they think they know what it says and therefore I don't have to actually dig into it. I feel so sorry for authors in this kind of situation because, I mean, this book is just frighteningly, uncommonly brilliant in every single way. There are sentences, paragraphs, chapters in here that are just truly epic. I'm in awe of Hayek's ability as a thinker and as a writer. So much insight, so much power to his prose. And it worries me when books become, legendary, but stay sort of more or less unread. By the way, this is my Christmas bird. Hope you like my bird. Hi, everybody from Liberty.me. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's Christmas season. He's happy to be out of the box, and he's sad to have to go. Don't put me back in the box at the end. That would be terrible. Well, he's going to have to go in the box after New Year's, probably. So enjoy him. He's got a matching hat and tie. So, in any case, so he's a free bird, more or less during this season. No, but anyway, back to Road Surf. I feel bad for books like this because they're too famous, so people don't read them. And there's so much in Hayek's in Road Surfing that foreshadows his future work and looks back at his past work, and yet deals in a very gripping way with the political moment of the time. Remember, he's living in England. England's at war with Germany. He's a classical liberal. Comes out of this sort of continental laissez-faire tradition, a former, not student, but colleague of Mises's, former socialist who was converted to the anti-socialist cause by Mises's book, Socialism, and is trying to figure out the best possible way to prevent England and America from going the way of the systems that they're fighting. So there's a penetrating irony about this time for anybody in the UK or the US, because the Allied powers are fighting totalitarian systems, fascism. They're trying to get rid of it, and using massive resources. But in the course of doing this, of course, they have the irony is that they elevate great leaders, right, to save the country. And these great leaders purport to have extraordinary intelligence on how to use national resources to win the war, with a unitary purpose. So you've got a united nation, and the planned economy is all the rage. So prices are controlled, wages are controlled, rations are sent out to the population at large. All production is planned. I mean, it's all kind of spooky. It's like we're going to war for an ideal, and what is that ideal? It's human freedom. And yet, to accomplish this war end, states are being set up to look very much like the states that they're fighting. And Hayek was overwhelmed by this reality. Also, the other thing to remember here about Hayek is that he wasn't an Englishman. I mean, he had only recently immigrated from Vienna, which was now a territory controlled entirely by the Nazis, and was part of the milieu that gave rise to the ideology that led Hitler to be elected and to bring about all this chaos in the region. So he sees it definitely as an extension of a kind of ideological move that occurred in the Austro-Germanic world. And he wants to take apart these ideological trends and warn the UK. And the warning goes something like this: just because you're on the opposite side of the current war, just because we're us and they are them, doesn't mean that we are entirely immune from becoming like them in the course of fighting them. We might, if we're not careful, adopt the same kinds of systems, and therefore defeat the whole purpose of the ideological, anyway, rationale for the war. So this becomes an obsession for him, because he's living in a country where, first of all, socialism as an ideal had been, the dominant theory of the intelligent class, the intelligentsia, I should say, especially the academic class, for the better part of 50 years or so. It was true at the University of Vienna, that he knew so well, and among Viennese academic circles, but it was also true in London. So socialism was considered this beautiful, glorious ideal, and yet fascism, rendered in Italy as fascism, and then a more extreme version, aggressively anti-Semitic version in Germany, re-rendered as National Socialism, you're considered to be the great enemy that we're fighting. They're unfree, we're free. And Hayek's asking the question, well, how distinct are these systems between free and unfree? And what do we have to do? What could cause us as a nation to move from the state of unfreedom to freedom, from freedom to unfreedom? What's the path that we have to enter onto? In order to understand that path, we have to understand the ideological basis of fascism and the government system that was erected to back it. So fundamentally, as I said in my last podcast, the important thing to remember about Road to Serfdom is that he's not talking about becoming Soviet Russia. And this is a critical confusion that often happens to people. The typical public rendering of this book is that Hayek warned, I mean, it's the dumbest line, because he says nothing like this. He warns that if you have welfare states, you'll eventually become like the Russian communists. You'll have a Russian communist system, and that'll lead to mass poverty and deprivation. I mean, that's the sort of pop rendering of the book. That is not what the book says. The book is primarily, in fact, it doesn't address Russia much at all, since, I mean, there was no threat of a Russian-style Bolshevik revolution or imposition of communism at all in the UK, much less in the US. Red socialism was not a danger. There was not a clear and present danger in any of the developed world. Hayek just considers that a sort of done deal. I mean, for that matter, Russia itself had long ago backed away from the extremist communist vision of how society should work. I mean, that had been abandoned for, well, a little more than 20 years at this point. So what Hayek wants to call serfdom, which is a state of being unfree and living under a central plan of an imposed system that denies society the opportunity to evolve spontaneously. Hayek is not so interested in classifying this as either left or right. It's either free or unfree, as far as he's concerned. And so a good part of the book is spent sort of mixing with your brain and causing you to realize that the left and right have much more in common than they might pretend. They have cultural differences, they have political differences, propagandistic differences, different treatments of religion and other matters, and we'll go into that here in a little bit. But basically, we've, to his mind, adopted sort of a false schemata to understand the world. False in the sense of left and right, and false in the sense of us versus them. So he wants to break down these barriers in the English-speaking world, where we think we're the holy good ones who, just by necessity, because we're blessed by the gods, are necessarily going to be free, and then break down this idea that somehow the them is demonically possessed by a radically foreign ideology that has no familiarity with us whatsoever. One of his chapters, in fact, is called "The Totalitarians in Our Midst." That's a way of saying that, which is not to say like Joseph McCarthy, oh, the communists are under the bed, but rather the ideas that lead to an abolition of human liberty are in fact ubiquitous. They're all around us. And we have to be careful. We have to be aware of them and be on the alert to look out for them so that we don't pave the way for a society of an overweening state that denies individuals their rights, fundamental rights, and denies society the opportunity to evolve in a way that provides conditions for an ever more beautiful flourishing of technology and the social order and so on. So that's the thesis. It's not that we're going to become, if we create a welfare state, we're going to become Red Russia. It's that if we continue on the current path towards rejecting liberalism as an ideal, we will find ourselves with some or another version of a fascistic total state scenario that we're presently fighting in the war. That's the interesting and much more challenging and much more difficult and penetrating thesis that Hayek has. And so he sets up for himself a very high bar here. He has to break down a lot of presumptions that are extant in the world. Very radical. And I think it's very important that when you read the book, you remember the times, you remember the conditions, you remember just how unbelievably isolated Hayek was as an intellectual in England at the time, and for that matter, in the whole English-speaking world. This position he's taking in favor of a kind of, as he ends the book with a celebration of the ideals of commercial freedom of the 19th century, that position was held by a tiny, minuscule number of people. They were very much under fire in the press, in academia, in the public mind generally. So he's adopting a very minority position here. And so you have to kind of consider the courage that it took to write this book. Now, when Hayek wrote it, it's true that he didn't expect it to become an international bestseller. It was picked up and championed, and it just hit exactly the right moment and went viral. Which is something he didn't expect. At the end of the day, Hayek is most famous for this work. He didn't expect that. For him, it was just something he was writing in the middle of a war to saying England, U.S., let's not become, to go the way of our enemies here. Here's the problems that I see coming. Germany never saw it coming. A generation before Hitler never imagined that Germany would go this direction. So where are the trends and what's happening? How can history surprise us in the similar way? So as a moral man and as a hugely public-spirited intellectual, he was willing to stick his neck out and say the things that nobody else was willing to say. So just never forget that. If you're ever tempted to be critical of Hayek, which, I think you should be, as I will be tonight, just remember the level of courage and piety and daring that it took for him to say what he did say. So, it's never good to read a book like this in the abstract, as if it was written yesterday or a century ago. Think of the times, think of the cultural context. All of us as writers write within the current milieu. We can't escape it. It's what inspires us. It's what we're writing to address. It's what we're writing to affect. My own writings, I don't think about how they're going to be read in 50 years. I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. I don't know what the climate is going to be, and I don't know what the climate of opinion is going to be.
So I write for now. I write for the world that's around me, the ideas that are around me, and the world that exists as it exists, because that's all I can really know. And Hayek was the same way. So when you read him, think of it from that point of view. Think of just what a extraordinary thing it was to jump into the middle of this situation and say, we're not as good as what we think we are, and they're not as evil as everybody says, in the sense that it's not just the other. It's not just radically unfamiliar. In fact, there's a great deal of similarity between dominant ideas in academia today and the so-called free world. They share a lot of commonalities with the prevailing regime propaganda of the unfree world. There's a how would you say, the gradient, in this continuum between free and unfree. And unless you're very alert to the intellectual trends and the theoretical firmament that gives rise to fascism, you could find yourself falling into it very quickly. So I want to go through, I've broken down one of the chapters here. I want to discuss this with you here in a little bit. But when we last left off this book, we covered chapter 10, which I think is certainly it's the most famous chapter. It's Why the Worst Skin on Top chapter. And it might be the best chapter. I'm not entirely sure. Excerpts from this chapter are now on fee.org under resources. You can look at it and reread it yourself. But he's discussing the widespread impression that German, Russian, and Italian totalitarianism takes on a particularly vicious form because of German, Russian, and Italian culture, and that a totalitarianism of an English variety would be of a much different sort. It would be civil, it would be polite, it would be precise, it would be genuinely scientific, it would be humane. And what Hayek wants to argue in this last chapter is that this is just really not true. That morality, the choices we make and the ethics under which our system operates are by and large determined by the kinds of institutions we create. And that you can take a very good man or woman, put him or her in charge, and create an evil monster just by the necessity of the way the system has to work. It's true for the heads of state. It's true for the bureaucrats too. People find themselves doing things that they never would have imagined possible because the system has made it necessary to make the system work as it's supposed to work. So the core problem here is the totalist system of state control itself, not the particular administrators of the system. So and this is a confusion that comes about in democracy. I mean, it's very interesting how that chapter plays into our current political moment, because we're being asked to choose among whatever it is, 15 different candidates, and we keep asking ourselves, well, who's got the best temperament? It's not that temperament doesn't matter, but every one of these guys will enter into a structure of a system that's fundamentally exploitative. And they're going to face the problem of working to dismantle it, or not participating in it, or going along with it, and seeing its goals realized through all the egregious means that are implied within the structure of the system itself. And so very bad people are attracted to this, but much more importantly, this kind of system of government can make very bad people out of very good people, just because of the necessity. So they become immoral just because they're holding the power itself. And so he begins the chapter with the famous Acton quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," which is a good summary of what he argues. The problem is the theory and practice of totalitarianism, not the particular administrators and their values. Okay, so now we move on to the next chapter. I'm just going to jump right into it. Okay, the next chapter is quite, I think it's the worst chapter of the book. I don't know how else to put it. It's, no, I'm sorry. I'm going back one chapter. I think it's on security. I'm covering this one. This is the chapter that precedes the one, Why the Worst Get on Top. Chapter 9. This is the outline chapter. This is the chapter, if you want to read something that messes with your brain, and you'll discover Hayek that is inconsistent, I guess you would say, or maybe it's surprising, something that's a bit of a departure from the Hayek you think you know. This is definitely the chapter to read, and I think it's absolutely the weakest one. It's on security, and he's addressing not so much security as we talk about it today, like being safe from terrorists, at the football game or whatever. That's not the kind of security he's addressing. He's addressing essentially economic security, and here is Hayek's big bow to social democracy in a way, because he lays out his argument that something like a basic national income is not inconsistent with spontaneous self-ordering systems of freedom that he wants. And this is where he exercises his kind of, I don't want to call it resentment, but pushback against laissez-faire liberalism, as he perhaps knew it in Vienna, studying under Mises, or as he discovered in the 19th century, or as it existed in the 18th century, kind of what he would call, an extremist position that doesn't want the government to do anything, or my own position, which is I don't think it should be a government. Okay, so Hayek's got a problem with this view, and he goes way beyond, as in practice, wanting something like a minimalist Jeffersonian state, or a night watchman state of the Randian variety, maybe a Bastiat style minimal government. And he imagines that the government should provide this guaranteed income for everybody, so that they won't experience extreme deprivation. And he even has lines in there like, surely a society as rich as ours can provide a floor below which you cannot fall through no fault of your own. He does have a parenthetical at some point that it doesn't have to be provided by government. That's an important distinction. I mean, I guess no libertarian is going to have a problem with a guaranteed national income, provided it's private, right? But the minute you sort of put this into government, you're going to create all sorts of strange things happen. People just above because at some point it has to kick in, right? So people just above that level are going to prefer the utility of labor. They're going to forego the utility of labor in favor of leisure and adopt an income that qualifies you for the bare minimum subsistence, and supplement it through the black market or whatever. I mean, I don't know how this would play out itself in practice, but it would be definitely perverse. The other strange thing about that I find most remarkable about Hayek's chapter here, where he's recommending this sort of guaranteed national income and many other types of interventions, is that they're basically inconsistent with the rest of the book, where he's warning against rationalism. He's warning against the belief that you can design the perfect state, that any individual can control the central planning apparatus. It's almost like he sort of launders the regime in his own mind, and then like invents his own form of state and says this would be a good thing, But then he gets back to normal and says to everybody else, whatever you do, don't think you can launder the state and create your own system. That's rationalism, and it leads to fascism and the end of liberty. So it's like he's not really taking his own advice. So I wrote a paragraph here that I was going to post and I didn't do it. Hayek's wishes for a government he likes and programs of which he approves contradicts Hayek's own critique of the rational planning state. His suggested national income neglects the problem of power and the perverse incentives of both bureaucrats and beneficiaries. But most of all, it disregards Hayek's own warnings against using a machinery of power to design and plan a planned and supposedly rational social and economic structure. This is the burden of Hayek's whole work. He doesn't listen to his own teachings here. I don't think it really matters. I really don't for Hayek's argument here. As I said last week, intellectual work and learning is not about searching for saints and sinners, burning witches or canonizing people. It's about finding good insights, So if you bump into a place like this with Hayek, where he contradicts his own profound theoretical insights, it's not a problem. You just say, gosh, Professor Hayek, you should be more Hayekian. I don't see what's wrong with that. I don't see what's wrong with that attitude. If you can handle it, and it takes some maturity, then take it on. Now, Stefan Kinsella and I today were speculating about Hayek's views about this whole matter. Like, why does he include this chapter 9? And I think it's too simple an explanation to say that Hayek was seeking some sort of respectability among his colleagues. That to take an extremist laissez-faire position would cause him professional consternation and cause colleagues to look down on him as a brute, and therefore he compromised in order to elicit from them greater respect. I don't really believe that, because I think at the bottom of that claim is an implied duplicity that I think is unwarranted. I mean, Hayek was not duplicitous. It was not his way. He was not a fibber. He wasn't a liar. He didn't just make up things because for strategic rationales. I don't think that's what he was thinking, at least not directly. I suspect that what Hayek was thinking here was really two parts. One is that he did want a hearing for these ideas. He really thought the civilization itself was at stake. And it would be irresponsible and just gravely mistaken to come out with a creedal, sort of dogmatic laissez-faire position that could be so easily dismissed as that and therefore forgotten. I think he desperately wanted a hearing. So he was trying his best to concede everything he possibly could to the critics of laissez-faire capitalism, and to give them, not in a way of selling out, but to listen to them and concede as much as he possibly could, because he wanted them to hear him out. And a laissez-faire treatise on the level of a Bastiat or something like that, I think he suspects that it would not have gotten the kind of hearing that he wants. And it's not even to say Hayek believed in a national income, or he was willing to concede that something like that was necessary. Those are slightly different positions, and I'm not prepared to say which one Hayek took. But nonetheless, he's willing to concede here that a baseline income for the whole population is not inconsistent with a society that is primarily organized along the lines of spontaneous development and competition. He wanted a sort of general rule instead of a special interest rule. And he didn't find that inconsistent with what he was saying otherwise. There's another factor here too. I think Hayek was truly genuine. I mean, this book just doesn't come out of nowhere, right? He's not just making this up to make sales or to make an ideological point. I think he was genuinely concerned that England had become weirdly blind to the prospects of fascism all around. And he was genuinely concerned it was coming. 1944, yes, we're fighting a war. You don't know for sure if the war is going to be won, but even if it is won, how do you know that the systems that oppress so many and created such havoc throughout the whole of Europe wouldn't be ported over to England? I mean, he of all people would have a profound sense of the imminent danger of serfdom because he came from that world. I mean, he saw Austria and Germany go from a world of, Mises and Goethe and embrace of liberalism to gradually embrace the ideas of serfdom and then impose a totalitarianism that led to unspeakable calamities. He saw it happen in stages, and he looked around at England and the US and said, could it happen here? I mean, what is going to stop it here? Everybody else was like, oh no, that's not the way we are at all. We're not like the Germans. We're going to have a completely different kind of planned society. It'll be humane and preserve all forms of free speech and civil liberties and so on. And Hayek didn't believe it. So if Hayek believed that the price you have to pay to avoid that sort of fascist fate was that you had to have some bare minimum interventions, then I think he would say his view was that was what would be necessary. Now, like why would that forestall fascism and socialism? I think it's because he thought that the strongest argument that the socialists had against capitalism was essentially the disastrous scenario where there's vast amounts of the population that are never able to get enter onto the path of progress and social advancement. They're stuck. They're penniless. They can't seem to get ahead no matter what they do. And that was always the propaganda from the socialists. And I think from Hayek's point of view, it was like, if we can create institutions that can alleviate this kind of suffering and thereby forestall a horrendous experiment in economic planning, socialist economic planning, it's definitely worth doing that. And I can't speculate as to how he was thinking, but this was 1944. From everything you could see around him, he must have believed something along these lines. So I think that was the basis for this. In other words, his advocacy of national income extended not out of a desire, not out of socialistic thinking. It was his love of freedom and his fear of fascism and socialism that led him to advocate this, because he thought it might be the best system to protect against some kind of coming disaster. So anyway, that's my thinking here on chapter 9. Wow, I'm already more than halfway through my time. Let's move on to chapter 10, or rather skip chapter 10, move to chapter 11. This is this whole chapter on propaganda, and I tell you what, this is in many ways the most dated chapter, but thankfully so. And I'm going to return to this point here when we get to the end, because this is not going to be a universally depressing hangout, I can promise you. But he's discussing uses of government propaganda. Why does government use propaganda? Well, government is force. Government is coercion. Government instantiates its notion of what is and what is right into law and enforces it with the threat of violence and real violence. And with that necessarily comes an extremist dogmatism and a belief that that the rationale for doing these egregious things is necessarily true. If you're going to make a law about something, you have to really believe it, basically, and you have to convince everybody else to go along with it. And that's where propaganda comes from. It extends from the government's desperate desire to get everybody on board with its program. And I'm sure you can't either even imagine what it must have been like in the 1940s. There's obviously no internet, and there's not even really television to speak of, at least not widespread. And the only access anybody had was radio and the newspapers. The newspapers were expensive to print and not very revealing. But otherwise, you had a kind of an information blockade always. Government is powerful enough to dominate information flows. And this would have been true for centuries, essentially, and certainly true in the 1940 and 1944. There's no Twitter where you can get a different point of view. There's no Facebook groups where you can enter into a different world and get a whole variety of different perspectives. There's no Liberty.me out there where you're hanging around with like-minded people to help you sort of crowdsource knowledge enough to discern the truth through all the lies. There's just pretty much one source of information, and that's government. So he explains where propaganda came from, how it works, and how it manipulates the population, and why it's so essential to maintaining that sort of top-down system of rule. And I'm going to return to chapter 11 here at the end, because I think it's really the reason why we have every reason to be optimistic. Whereas Hayek's whole discussion here is about the impenetrability of a government propaganda apparatus. I mean, we don't face that today. We just don't. Okay, chapter 12. Time's moving very fast. Chapter 12. Here he discusses the socialist roots of fascism. And this is the chapter I can't even imagine how this must have been received in England. The land of the Fabians, the land of, 99 out of 100 professors, and it's true in the US too, are dedicated to socialism. It's true today, And so Hayek's standing up saying, you know what? The thing you claim to hate, fascism, is actually got its roots in socialism. So for that, and he demonstrates this through a kind of history of thought that basically socialism was radically unsuccessful in practice. So the socialists reconstituted themselves and regathered themselves and reemerged on the right flank, cast out the most egregious aspects of and unpopular aspects of socialism, reconstituted it, and came up with this new thing called fascism or National Socialism or whatever Francoism or whatever you want to call it. But it's still serfdom by another name. And he blames essentially socialism as being the origin of all this stuff. If you're wondering, well, I'll get to that in a second. So the left continues to deny this. Right? I mean, like to this day, they want to recast fascism as being a completely alien system. Don't forget that in the time of England, the only thing everybody agreed on was that fascism was bad, right? Fascism's bad. Fascism's evil. So whatever fascism is can't have anything in common with what you are. Hayek comes along and shatters all that and says, you know what? They're not just distant cousins to the socialists. They are socialists, just of a different form. Just a devastating chapter. I can't even imagine what it must have been like. He says, in practice, fascism represents a sort of culmination of the end of individualism. That fascism comes about when the left and the right come together and discover a more expedient way of achieving their totalitarian designs. Now, how is right fascism different from left socialism? He says that from an ideological point of view, the left, socialists, continue to retain some portion of their liberal roots. Now, to understand what he means by this, you have to understand a little bit about English socialism and then American socialism, and understand that it's distinct from what you're going to read in like the Communist Manifesto or something like that. Because in English socialism and American socialism, you have this celebration of democracy as an end in itself, the participatory democracy. If we can all participate in making decisions together, then that's absolutely critical. It's not democracy for any directed purpose. It's democracy itself is the achievement we're looking for. So that's a really important element of socialist ideology. And also, and very crucially, left socialism, as it was manifested in England and the US, and really under Marx too, was necessarily non-nationalist or is internationalist in scope. It believed in universals, so the systems that should pertain to the US should also pertain to Mexico and Canada, that borders are arbitrary lines on the map. We should have one system for the whole world. So internationalism. Fascism departs from the liberal, by liberal I mean classical liberal, or more generally just liberal, strains of left socialism by rejecting both democracy and internationalism, and reaches for a much more organic style. So it learns through political expediency that people don't like politicians who cast aspersions on their nationhood, on their religion, on their national ethos, on their history, on their literature, on who they are as a people. So it remixes everything, casts out the liberalism of democracy and internationalism, and replaces those things with nationalism, religious celebrations of religion instead of just sort of radical atheism or whatever. It celebrates a nation's history. It tries to find the true spirit of the German people, the true spirit of the Italian people, the fundamental thing that makes up what it means to be Spanish, or in America. Well, I don't want to get into that. It tries to find that organic matter and reconstitute it into a kind of a new kind of totalitarianism that dispenses with whatever elements of liberalism currently exist within left socialist thinking. So in a funny and interesting way, Hayek sees fascism as more illiberal than socialism. So you see here, he sees it as the ultimate enemy. The thing that's the most pressing threat and the most politically likely result, and especially damaging because it contains no liberal thinking within it at all. It sees truly no limits to the power of the nation state over the individual at all. Whereas left socialism, has a belief in participatory democracy, a kind of internationalist conviction, and you can see even today, you can listen to it in Bernie Sanders' speeches, right? It's so weird. He's like celebrating big government all the time, and then he'll turn around suddenly and say, "Oh, but there should be no surveillance. We've got to stop these human rights abuses by police. Gays should be free to marry." Whatever. It's like, wait a minute, how come you're suddenly talking about freedom now? Well, that's because of the liberal elements that exist within 20th century socialist ideology. Whereas right socialism or fascism, same thing, is glad to dispense with this, entirely. So I've got a paragraph that I quoted from this chapter because I like it so much. The doctrines which guided the ruling elements in Germany for the past generation, he's writing in 1944, so the past generation, were not opposed to the socialism in Marxism, but to the liberal elements contained in it, its internationalism and its democracy, as it became increasingly clear that it was just these elements which formed obstacles to the realization of socialism. The realization meaning the political manifestation. It's realization. It's political success. Once that became obvious that it was these elements that were preventing them from achieving victory, the socialists of the left more and more approached those of the right. And it was the union of these two anti-liberal, anti-capitalistic forces of the right and the left, this fusion of radical socialism and conservative socialism, which drove out from Germany everything that was liberal. So we're squeezed out. The left and the right were left to suffer, to either choose between these two or be irrelevant. That's when fascism takes over. Okay, now I think next to chapter 10, the next chapter, chapter 13, is the most important chapter, and it's got the extremely provocative title called Totalitarianism in Our Midst. You can see how Hayek is getting ever, as the book proceeds, brick by brick, and it really is just a very systematic work. He's getting ever more overt in what he's trying to say. So what I did here, and I don't have that much time left, but I just want to go through this, and maybe I'll try to write this up, but I broke down chapter 10. What he wants to do is identify certain signals within the political firmament and intellectual firmament that make it vulnerable to becoming fascistic. The signs. Doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow or next year, but it could happen in 10 years, maybe 20 years, whatever, just down the line. What are the pre-existing conditions that lead to the coming of serfdom? I've listed 10 here, and they're kind of all over the map, and he doesn't list these 10, all right? So I just kind of extracted these from the chapter. Number 1, a widespread belief that it can't happen here. Germany can't happen here. We'll never be like Italy. If that dude Mussolini shows up here, we're all going to throw eggs at him, If we had a Hitler, some dopey guy with a mustache or whatever, we'd just say, laugh him out and say, get the heck out of here, If we did have a gigantic government that was at war and controlled massive aspects of people's economic and social and cultural lives, it would be much more polite. We have nice bureaucrats. We have a culture of toleration. I mean, we're never going to be putting people in concentration camps. That's not who we are or how we do. Ruling it out completely, it can't happen here. This is the number one presumption. Like, if you just rule out the possibility that it could ever happen in your mind, you find anybody online like Godenzola that invokes Hitler to be absurd, then actually you've made yourself blind to certain realities that are in your midst. It's fascinating to me recently because I've written a lot of articles discussing the relationship between Trump, our strongman, our own dictator, our own politician who wants to rule by his individual will, making the system centralized under his expert management. I've written a lot of articles about the fascistic overtones to his campaign. And Vox the other day, typically from the left, right? Typically, wrote a big article saying, "Oh, come on, Trump's not a fascist." And why? And they quoted all these fascist experts, and they said that Trump hasn't attacked democracy. The left has just such a blindness on these things. first of all, they want to think that socialism and fascism are opposite when they're really the same. So they want to figure out, like, in what ways Trump is not a fascist. And what they say is that fascists don't believe in democracy, because they believe in democracy. Fascists don't believe in democracy, and Trump hasn't yet attacked democracy as such. So therefore, he's not a fascist. And this is another way of saying, it can't happen here. Well, look, I read this article and I found it just egregious, because, if you're running for an election, you don't attack democracy. I mean, come on, you use democracy. If you're a would-be dictator and you're on top and you're pulling the top of everything, you love democracy. Democracy is great if it serves your ends. Why would you attack democracy? So anyway, I can't even believe that article. Anyway, so this tendency to just rule out the possibility that it can happen here is the first condition. The second one, and I'm running short of time, I have to burn through these much faster than I wanted to. Number two, there's an increasing similarity between the economic views of the left and the right, in that both completely rule out liberalism as a system, free enterprise, letting things alone, capitalism, free enterprise, free entrepreneurial sphere, the forces of supply and demand. If both the left and the right are unwilling to defer to the market as a signaling mechanism, as an engine of prosperity, but rather their economic views seem very almost identical, this is another precondition. And I see this all around us. I mean, it's fascinating to me when you hear conservatives say they want to repeal Obamacare. It's like, oh yeah, which part of Obamacare do you want to get rid of? How about the mandates that insurers pay no regard to pre-existing conditions? How about that? Oh no, we have to retain that. It's like, what? Okay, well, what about third-party provision where businesses are under certain mandates to provide healthcare? Oh no, we got to preserve that. I mean, once you begin to take it apart, you see there's like virtually no aspect of Obamacare that they actually want to get rid of. And if you listen to the debates, I mean, it's depressing for those of us who, love what the free economy has done to the world. Ended poverty practically around the globe in ways that we've never seen before. Created standards of living that are incomparably high, massively expanded lifespans, led to systems that were supporting the level of population increases that would have been unthinkable a century ago, or say nothing of a millennium ago. And just the achievements of the market are so awesome, bringing so much health, wealth, and well-being to so many billions of people, and yet not a single person running for public office can seem to manage to take a few minutes out to acknowledge this or celebrate this, or to thank the market for what it's done for the world. No, it's just not even, I can barely distinguish between the views of the left and the right anymore on economic topics. They both rule out liberalism. A third element, I'm running short of time, I have to move through this very, very quickly. Veneration of the state and an admiration of power, which is to say a kind of deference to the leadership principle. And I don't know, I mean, yeah, this is definitely a part of our world today, veneration of the state. It's more intense now than it ever has been in my lifetime. That much I'm certain of. I was at the airport the other day and walking with these poor soldiers, most of whom were, signed up to be part of the patriotic, Army for Freedom or whatever. Maybe they're in there for economic reasons. They want to get free tuition at college or whatever the thing is. And I mean, they were being bothered. They couldn't even sit in a bar by themselves without having, members of the petite bourgeoisie come along and say, thank you for your service, thank you for your service, thank you for your service. And they got this the whole time. And I was looking at these guys, and I don't know what they're thinking, but in their minds they might be thinking, well, if you like it so much, why don't you take my place? I'd like to be in your position. I I don't really want to go back to Iraq. I don't want to go to Afghanistan. I certainly don't want to be sent to Syria. I don't want to be sent off in a new crusade. I mean, most of the enlisted are very aware of the problems of the state, that it's not some holy institution. They mostly think it's a gigantic screw up. They can't wait to get out. But the hoi polloi, just venerate agents of the state and the state itself and power as some sort of magical tool in life. 3 minutes left in my thing here. And I'm on number 4, so I have to move very quickly. Number 4, enthusiasm for organizing everything. Everything has to be organized. Nothing can be outside rational construction. We can't just say, oh, here's a wonderful system called Airbnb. This seems to be working just fine on its own. No, if something new exists, it's got to be regulated. It's got to be controlled. It's got to be organized, and it's got to fit in with other things. We've got to have a central plan. We've got to have a plan. We've got to have a system. What kind of society are we living in where we don't have a system? Enthusiasm for organizing everything. Disparagement of number 5, disparagement of organic development of society. If anybody stands up and says, well, I don't really know how that's going to work, but I'm sure that because we have the mechanisms that enable signals because of competition and market signaling, we're going to discover a new way just organically. I mean, a person holds that view now is not even part of the conversation. Number 6 is expediency over principles. Where are the principles? We're just going to do what works. There's no principles, no firm ideas that we believe in, no lines we won't cross. It's all just a matter of we'll figure it out as we go along. Number 7, the mysterious disappearance of liberal intellectuals from the past. And this is a very disturbing thing. I mean, Hayek reports in Germany that the German liberal tradition was completely forgotten, and it's true in Italy, and it's true in Spain. It's true all over Europe. Great traditions of the past are just gone, considered to be irrelevant. And you see a little bit of this in our own time. I mean, I spent a good part of my career trying to salvage from the wreckage, the great thoughts of people like Albert J. Nock and John T. Flynn, H.L. Mencken, Mises, for that matter, Hayek, under a firmament in which society gets detached from its liberal roots. There's a mysterious disappearance of liberal intellectuals. They just are not read anymore. They're not discussed in classrooms. They're not part of the cultural firmament. Every time you bring them up in a public speech, people look at you like you have no idea what you're talking about. So number 8, there's no more distinction between society and state. The state is an extension of the will of the collective of individuals. And certainly I think that's a prevailing attitude in our time. Number 9, there's a penchant for scientific management of the social order. So the scientists ascend to the top. If you have massive amounts of technical knowledge, then you're allowed to speak on a topic and dictate policy. I mean, you read this chapter 13, and as you read, consider the climate change frenzy that we've gone through recently, where these climatologists have been dragged out of obscurity, to cobble together a global plan for ending the Industrial Revolution, for ending the industrialization itself, in 100 years or whatever the hell it is. And you begin to see, here's a penchant for scientific management of the social order, to say the least. And number 10, that's the final point I'll make on this chapter. When societies when the prevailing attitude is that society should have a single purpose, just one purpose, just one goal. Hayek uses the example of war. In wartime, single purpose societies something we've all experienced. But when intellectuals and people become intolerant of a diversity of expression, a diversity of lifestyles, a diversity of religions, then you've laid the ground for serfdom. Because a single-purpose society necessarily involves central planning and top-down management, and an intolerance for the vast, infinite complexity of the human population as it exists within individual minds. Single-purpose societies are necessarily totalitarian. So that's chapter 10. Sorry, it's chapter 13. I think it's next to chapter 10, probably the best chapter. Moving on to chapter 14, I'm just going to, this is more of a theoretical chapter where he discusses the alternative to the fascist style management and the intellectual conditions that lead to the illiberalism. And he's talking about liberalism, and I really like this sentence, and I just want to read it to you. We are every day helping to build something. We every day are helping to build something that's greater than any of us can fully comprehend. I really like that sentence, because I think once you understand that, then you can rule out central planning. You can rule out top-down management. You can rule out dictatorships and over-regulation of society, of impositions of single religions or plans. Once you understand that the social order is much greater and much more complex than some of its parts, and that no individual mind can possibly fathom the fullness of it all. And this, I think, my friends, and this is the reason that we have to be optimistic. One is that we're living in an unprecedented technological revolution now. We have access to information as never before. So that whole chapter on propaganda that Hayek writes, I think it's chapter 11, no longer pertains to us. We do have access now that we've never had before. And the other thing is that through the dispersion of knowledge through technology, the complications of the social order have become infinitely more pronounced in our time than they ever have been in the whole history of humanity. To put it in a phrase, I would just say that I think there's a sense in which totalitarianism, as it was once known, is now unpracticable in any fundamental way. It might be attempted. There could be grievous costs along the way, but I don't think there's any chance that it could ever be realized in the way it was in the past. I think that vision that a certain generation holds today of a rationally organized society from the top down is no longer something that is achievable. Given everything that's happened to us. I think the internet came along just in time, basically, to protect us from a new totalitarianism. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't stay active, that we shouldn't stay alert. We shouldn't be willing to look at the signs and identify and name the names of people who are trying to take us back to an illiberal age. But I think it does mean that we have more reason for hope now than we've probably ever had in the history of humanity, because we are coming together in different ways, in different forms, through different information flows than we've ever experienced. I don't believe that the masters of statecraft will ever fully control the world. Okay, so that's enough of Hayek for tonight. A frighteningly brilliant and awesome book. I hope you've enjoyed these sessions with me. I've enjoyed very, very much getting to know this book more in greater detail. Let's stay together, alert to the signs of serfdom all around us, and continue to resist as individuals and in the communities that you inhabit. All the best to you. Happy holidays. Thank you for being a member of Liberty.me. And take care, my friends. Bye-bye.